It's a great pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to thank JD for his very warm welcome and for inviting me here. And I also deeply appreciate everyone coming out to hear me talk tonight. I will do my best to give you an interesting story. What I'm going to talk about today is the whole question of why U.S. foreign policy, since the end of the Cold War, and certainly since 9/11, has been largely one disaster after another. Why has the United States had a failed foreign policy? If you think about where we were back in the early 1990s when the Cold War ended, just how much optimism there was in the air. Some of the older people in the audience surely remember that very well. We thought we had the wind at our back, history was on our side, and it was going to be all peace, love, and dope from here on out. And if you look at the world today, you look at the state of American foreign policy, you look at who's in the White House in the United States, it's quite clear that things went badly awry. And the question is, what happened here? Now, here's my basic story. The United States pursued a foreign policy of liberal hegemony after the Cold War, and its main aim was basically to remake the world in America's image. The policy failed miserably, and then the question is why? And basically my argument is that nationalism and realism are the two most powerful isms in the world, the two most powerful political ideologies, and they trumped this liberal foreign policy at every turn. Now I want to make it very clear that I am not a critic of liberalism as a political system. I consider myself to be very fortunate to have been born in the United States of America, which is a liberal democracy. I personally believe that liberal democracy is the best political system on the planet. It's far from perfect, but it is the best available political order. My argument is that a liberal foreign policy is a prescription for disaster, that liberalism abroad is different than liberalism at home. I just want to be very clear on that point as I move forward. Here's my basic outline. It's very important for me to explain to you exactly what I mean by liberalism, exactly what I mean by nationalism, and then to talk about what is this foreign policy called liberal hegemony. Then I want to talk about why the United States pursued it starting in the early 1990s. I want to talk about what its track record looks like, and basically I'm going to point out what I think are the three big failures: the Bush Doctrine in the Middle East, NATO and EU expansion into Eastern Europe, and engagement with China. Those are the really big failures. And then I'm going to talk about why liberal hegemony failed. And of course, what I'm going to do here is talk about the relationship between realism and nationalism on one hand and liberal hegemony on the other. And then we'll talk about liberal hegemony's future. So that's the basic laydown tonight. So let me start by talking about what liberalism is. Key thing you have to understand about liberalism is that it's based on two simple assumptions. The first assumption is that we are born as individuals, and then we form social contracts. One of the big questions you have to ask yourself about human nature is whether or not you think human beings are social animals from the get-go, whether you think they're tribal from the beginning, and then they carve out space for their individuality, or whether you think that they're individuals at the get-go who form social contracts. Very important distinction. And where you come out here really matters for how you think about the world. Liberals focus on the individual. Liberalism is an individualistic political philosophy or an individualistic ideology. You all know that people like John Locke, a canonical liberal, and Thomas Hobbes, who, although he's not a liberal, was one of the founding fathers of liberalism, right, talked about individuals in the state of nature who form a social contract. They're called social contract theorists. So they start with individuals and go to social contracts. To get way ahead of myself here, nationalism is predicated on the assumption that we are all social animals. We are born into tribes. From the moment we come out of our mother's womb, right, we are heavily socialized. We are part of a group. Okay? But liberalism, again, focuses on the individual. The individual takes precedence over the group. Second thing you want to remember about liberalism, it assumes that individuals cannot reach universal agreement over first principles. Big questions. Those differences are sometimes so profound that they lead to violence. And of course, what motivated Hobbes and Locke in good part was the fact that Catholics and Protestants were killing each other in huge numbers in England. And as you all know, you can't use your critical faculties to figure out whether Catholicism is a superior religion to Protestantism or vice versa, or whether it's better to be an atheist or take an issue like abortion. I know some extremely smart people in the United States who favor abortion and some extremely smart people who oppose abortion. And you can't get any consensus. So liberalism assumes that we cannot use our critical faculties to reach universal agreement, to come up with truths about first principles, about questions about the good life. And in fact, sometimes people disagree so much about first principles that they're willing to kill each other, Catholics and Protestants. So the central question is, this is what liberalism is faced with, how should politics be arranged to deal with this potential for violence? This is the liberal solution. Most people don't think consciously about this, but this is the world we live in the United States, in Germany, and the liberal democracies. First is, we say everybody has a set of individual rights. And when we say everybody, that means everybody on the planet. Those rights, those individual rights, remember, we're focusing on the individual. Those individual rights are inalienable. This is enormously important, as will become clear in a few minutes, for understanding liberal hegemony, because it comes right out of this first assumption. In other words, everybody on the planet has a set of rights. The focus is on individuals. It's not on tribes. You're not saying people who are Germans or people who are Americans or people who are Russians have rights and others don't. You're saying everybody does, because it's a philosophy or an ism or an ideology that's based on the individual. So every person has this set of rights. Second thing is you pervade the norm of tolerance, right? If this gentleman wants to be a Catholic and I want to be a Protestant, he has the right to be a Catholic, I have the right to be a Protestant. But secondly, we tolerate that difference. I might not like his religion, he might not like my religion, but we tolerate each other. Of course, tolerance only goes so far. So that's why you need a state. You need a state basically to act as a night watchman, to make sure I don't kill him and he doesn't kill me, because we have such deep-seated differences about religion or abortion or affirmative action. You pick the issue, right? So that's the liberal solution. Now, the taproot of liberal hegemony, and I'll talk more about this as we go along, is that when you have an ideology that focuses on the individual and everybody on the planet has inalienable rights, and those rights really matter, you have a universalistic ideology. It is not a particularistic ideology like nationalism. It is a universalistic ideology. I'll say more about that as we go along. Talk a little bit about nationalism. Humans are naturally social animals in this story. They're born into and heavily socialized into particular groups. And individualism takes a back seat. This is what nationalism is all about. Nationalism assumes we're all very tribal. We are Germans, we are Hungarians, we are Japanese, we are Koreans. Right? We're part of different groups. And of course, in the modern world, aside from the family, the most important group in today's world is the nation. That is the highest group with significant meaning. And virtually everybody on the planet belongs to a particular nation. Say a little bit more about this. This is my definition of nationalism. Nationalism is a set of political beliefs which hold that a nation, there's the nation, body of individuals with characteristics that purportedly distinguish them from other groups should have their own state. Nation states, see that word, nation states? The concept of a nation state embodies nationalism. Think of Theodor Herzl's famous book. Theodor Herzl, as you all know, is the father of Zionism. And he wrote a book, most famous book. It's called The Jewish State. The Jewish state, nation state, Jews are a nation, should have their own state. Think of the Palestinians. What do the Palestinians want today? Palestinians want their own state, nation state, Palestinian state. Go to Catalonia. What do Catalonians want? They want their own state, nation state. Catalonians view themselves as different from Spain or Spanish people. We versus the other. Okay, nationalism. You look out at the planet today, just to get ahead of myself here, you look out at the planet today, the planet is filled with nothing but nation states. If you went back to Europe in 1450 and you looked at a map of Europe in 1450, no states, not even dynastic states, much less nation states. Duchies, principalities, empires, city-states. An incredibly complicated map. That's what Europe would look like. You look at a map of the world today, nothing but nation states. That's the power of nationalism. Now, nations place enormous importance on sovereignty, right, or self-determination. That's why they want their own state. Why do the Catalonians want their own state? Why do the Jews want their own state? Why do the Palestinians want their own state? Because they want sovereignty. They want to make their own decisions. They want self-determination. They understand that the best way to have self-determination is to have your own state. Sovereignty really matters. So you want to keep that in mind. And, as I say down below here, nation states place enormous importance on sovereignty, which inclines them in powerful ways to resist foreign interference. You know, when those Russians interfere in the American elections, it just drives the Americans crazy. Who are they to interfere with our sovereignty? If the Russians were to interfere in German elections, you would be apoplectic because you believe that Germany is a sovereign state. Oh, excuse me, it's not a sovereign state, it's a sovereign nation state, right? So you want to remember the importance of sovereignty. Nationalism versus liberalism. Nationalism beats liberalism at every turn. Human beings are primarily social animals. We are not born as individuals who then form social contracts. I did not choose to be an American. I was not born in the state of nature, nor were you. We did not get together and decide to form a social contract that created Germany or the United States. We were born into these tribes. We're primarily social animals. That's not to say we can't carve out room for our individualism. And as I said to you before, if you look at the planet, it's covered by nation states. Liberal democracies have never comprised even 50% of the states in the system. And since the year 2006, the number of liberal democracies in the international system is declining. And then finally, you want to remember that all liberal democracies, Germany included, and the United States included, and Britain included, all liberal democracies are liberal nation states. We don't talk in this language, right? Because nationalism is a dirty word here in Germany, and it's actually a dirty word in the United States as well. But it is a very powerful force, and you really want to understand it. And when you don't understand it, you end up in a lot of trouble. All right, what's liberal hegemony? Okay, I've laid out for you what liberalism is and nationalism is. What's liberal hegemony? As I said to you, it's basically an attempt to remake the world in America's image. And it has three components. The first, and the most important, that's why I put 3 stars up there, is to spread liberal democracy across the planet. It's to make every state on the planet look like the United States of America. The second goal is to integrate more and more countries into the open international economy that the United States and its European allies and its Asian allies created during the Cold War. Right? So the idea is you want to get more and more countries hooked on capitalism. You want to integrate them into the international economy. You want to make them all economically interdependent. And then the final component of liberal hegemony is you want to integrate more and more countries into international institutions. And international institutions are very important in this story. And let me give you an example of liberal hegemony at work. And it had to do with NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolutions. You all understand that starting in the mid-1990s, the United States and its European allies began to expand NATO eastward. They began at the same time to expand the EU eastward, and then they began to promote color revolutions in places like Ukraine and Georgia. You all remember the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Just think about what's going on here. What we were trying to do was spread institutions eastward. We're trying to spread the EU and NATO eastward. We're trying to get these states in Central and Eastern Europe integrated into these institutions, because we believe that once states become integrated into institutions, they obey the rules. Institutions are really all about rules. And if you can get states embedded in these institutions, they obey the rules. And if states obey the rules, they don't cause wars. They don't cause trouble. They're rule-abiding citizens. They're responsible stakeholders. You've heard that term, right? What about getting more countries hooked on capitalism? What do you think EU expansion is all about? EU expansion was all about bringing prosperity to Eastern Europe, make all those people rich and happy like we have here in Germany, and they won't cause any trouble because they're doing very well for themselves. This is basically the economic interdependence argument. So you want to take countries like Ukraine, countries like Poland, and you want to make them prosperous. You want to integrate them into the economy, the way we did with Germany, France, Italy, and so forth and so on during the Cold War. And then finally, you want to spread democracy. This is what the Orange Revolution and the Rose Revolution are all about. And furthermore, you want to consolidate democracy in places like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states. Right? These are new democracies. You want to make sure that they become sturdy democracies, and at the same time, you want to promote democracy further east through the color revolutions. Right? So you see, what happened here when the Cold War ended is we began to move eastward, not for balance of power reasons. We were not moving eastward to contain Russia. This is a story we invented after the Ukraine crisis blew up in our face. But we were not expanding NATO eastward, expanding the EU eastward, and promoting the color revolutions to contain Russia. No, this was a policy of liberal hegemony, which is to do in Eastern Europe what we believed we had done in Western Europe during the Cold War. We basically had burned war out of the system. Right? All right. Now, what are the benefits of liberal hegemony? There are three main benefits of liberal hegemony. The first is that it eliminates significant human rights violations. And you're saying to yourself, why is this the case? It is the case because if you make every country on the planet a liberal democracy, then you take away the problem of massive violations of human rights. We don't worry about massive violations of human rights in liberal democracies. So if you can make every country a liberal democracy, that problem is taken away. And again, liberalism is an ideology that privileges rights. And it privileges individual rights across the entire planet. You Germans care greatly about human rights in places outside of Germany. Human rights are universal values in your story. And the same thing is true in the United States. Once you believe in universal values, right, and you believe that you have to protect the rights of everyone on the planet so that there are no mass violations of those rights, you got to come up with a way to do that. And you don't want to be constantly interfering, with a rapid deployment force in different countries all around the world. It's much simpler if you just turn every country into a liberal democracy. The problem is taken off the table. That's one great advantage. The second great advantage is we believe in the West that liberal democracies don't fight other liberal democracies. That means if you get a planet that's filled with liberal democracies, it is peace, love, and dope. This is basically Frank Fukuyama's argument in that famous article, The End of History. Frank said that if we spread liberal democracy all over the planet, you know what's going to be the biggest problem we face for the rest of our lives? Boredom. That's what he says at the end of the article. Boredom. Why? Because nobody's going to fight anybody anymore. Okay? So you want to understand that as you're spreading NATO and the EU eastward, and you're promoting the color revolutions, what you're doing, right, is you're creating a huge space on the continent where there is not going to be a human rights disaster and where you're going to have peace. And by the way, if you think proliferation, nuclear proliferation, and terrorism are big problems, if you create a peaceful world, those problems are taken off the table. Just getting ahead of myself, this is what the Bush Doctrine was all about. The Bush Doctrine was all about spreading liberal democracy across the Middle East for the purpose of taking the terrorism and the proliferation problems off the table. So those are the first two advantages. And the third advantage, which I won't go into in any details, what Woodrow Wilson called making the world safe for democracy. And the idea here is if you create a world of nothing but democracies, then the dissidents in your liberal democracy, the illiberal forces in your liberal democracy, have no outside countries that they can turn to for help. When I was a young boy and grew up in the United States, we had communists, and we worried that those communists would form an alliance with the Soviet Union. If the world doesn't have any communist countries, it's just all liberal democracies, then you don't have to worry about those communists in your midst or whoever, you know, forming an alliance with a distant great power. So these are the great advantages of liberal democracy. And again, this kind of thinking is what underpinned NATO expansion, the Bush Doctrine, and engagement with China. Now, why did the United States pursue liberal hegemony? I'll make 3 points here. The important permissive condition is unipolarity. You have to have unipolarity. Unipolarity means there's only one great power in the system, what we sometimes refer to as the sole pole, right? And of course, when the Cold War ends, and then certainly after the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, the United States is the only great power on the planet. We're in a unipolar world. We went from bipolarity to unipolarity, and as you all know, we're now moving into multipolarity. But in this unipolar moment, right, the United States was so powerful that it did not have to worry about balance of power politics. If the Soviet Union is out there, or China's out there, or Putin's Russia's out there, you got to worry about the balance of power. And you can't pursue liberal hegemony. But if you're so powerful, if you're Godzilla, right, but you're a liberal democracy, then you're free to pursue liberal hegemony. So it's very important to understand was the fact that the United States was so powerful that it allowed it to pursue this policy. Second reason we pursued liberal hegemony is the United States is a profoundly liberal country. Again, this is a wonderful thing. I'm glad I grew up in this country. But it is profoundly liberal. And it is hardly surprising when it had an opportunity to put aside balance of power politics and start spreading liberal democracy all over the planet and remaking the world in its image. The United States quickly adopted that policy. Third point I want to make to you is, and this is an interesting point, America is a very nationalistic country. Again, we never talk about this. As I often say, if you go to a major research library at a university in the United States, probably one wing of that library is devoted to books written about American liberalism. And you'll be lucky if you can find one shelf worth of books on American nationalism. We just don't write about it, right? But America is a very nationalistic country. Think American exceptionalism. But my favorite example is Madeleine Albright. You all know Madeleine Albright, card-carrying liberal hegemonist. The woman has never seen a war she didn't want to fight for the purposes of spreading liberal democracy across the planet. But anyway, her most famous comment is she was once asked why the United States is interfering in everybody's business here on planet Earth. And she said, it's because we are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further. Now just think about those words. We, as opposed to the other. We as opposed to the other. That's nationalism. Oh, and by the way, she said, we are the indispensable, there's the word, nation. We are the indispensable nation. And of course, what you get with this talk about us being indispensable, us standing taller, us seeing further, this is the chauvinism that's at the heart of nationalism. So actually what you get in the early 1990s and throughout the 90s and up until really when Donald Trump gets elected, is you have American policymakers, right, who are juiced up not only on liberalism, but nationalism as well. This sense of American exceptionalism. American policymakers believe we have the right, we have the responsibility, and we have the power to remake the world in our own image, which again means those three things: spreading democracy, getting people hooked on capitalism, and getting them embedded in institutions. Let's talk a little bit about the track record. I won't spend much time on this. Bush Doctrine in the greater Middle East, oh my God. It's just hard to believe how much murder and mayhem we have created in the Middle East. Really hard to believe. The number of people who have died, who have been displaced from their homes. You wouldn't mind if we eventually won these wars and fixed the problems, but they're all lost wars. Does anybody seriously believe we're going to win the war in Afghanistan? It's the longest war in American history, 17 years, right? Trump is just kicking the can down the road so he doesn't get blamed for losing Vietnam, the way Obama was kicking the can down the road so he didn't get blamed for losing Afghanistan. Iraq? Holy smokes. Syria, you know the big refugee crisis you had here in Europe a few years ago? You understand that's compliments of Uncle Sam, right? Just amazing. Libya, we turned that place into the Wild West, and now we're doing wonderful things in Yemen. Jeez, hard to believe. That's the Bush Doctrine. Remember what the Bush Doctrine was. The Bush Doctrine was designed to spread democracy across the Middle East. Iraq, most of you young people probably don't know this because you saw the American military crash and burn in Iraq, right? But Iraq was supposed to be the first stop on the railroad line. We were then going to do Syria and Iran, and we thought at some point we wouldn't have to do any more because everybody would throw their hands up. But we would democratize the entire region. And of course, once you democratize the entire region, you solve the human rights violation problem. Think Saddam, think Assad. You make the world peaceful, or you make the region peaceful. And remember what I said, that takes the proliferation and terrorism problems off the table. So forth and so on. But the Bush Doctrine was a total failure. Then there's the Ukraine crisis. Most of you, I'm sure, believe that the Russians are responsible for the Ukraine crisis. I'll talk more about this in a few minutes, but the Russians are not responsible for the Ukraine crisis. The idea that you could take NATO and march it up to the Russians' border and they're just going to smile and be happy and believe that the United States is a benign hegemon and all it's really interested in doing is creating this zone of peace on Russia's border, and Russia should actually be thankful for that. It's not the way the world works, right? And the Russians were screaming bloody murder about NATO expansion from the mid-90s forward. But anyway, we have a huge crisis. And what are the results of this crisis? It's bad news for Germany. Germany is suffering economically because of the counter-sanctions, right? The Russians are suffering from this. The Americans need the Russians on all sorts of issues like containing China, dealing with Iran, and so forth and so on. And instead, we've made them adversaries. And the people who are suffering the worst on this are the Ukrainians. This is a lose, 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 lose situation. And then finally, there's engagement with China. The basic name of the game here, China's rising. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to engage China. We're going to get it hooked on capitalism. Let's get it in the WTO, which we did in 2001. Let's get it embedded in all these institutions. Let's turn it into a responsible stakeholder, and then it will become a democracy. Well, it didn't become a democracy, and if anything, it's going in the other direction. Meanwhile, we created Godzilla #2. And from an American point of view, this is not a good thing. The United States would much prefer to remain the unipole, not enter a bipolar or multipolar world. 0 for 3 on big issues. All right, why did it fail? JD has, indicated what my argument is, and you pretty well understand it at this point. Let me deal mainly with the first and third points here. Power and nationalism. Remember what I said to you about nationalism? Nationalism is all about sovereignty. You've got to remember that. People in particular countries around the planet do not like foreigners coming in and doing social engineering, especially at the end of a rifle barrel. I went into the American military in 1965. I went to the Army. I'm an enlisted man in the Army, 1965. And I got out 1975. It's coterminous with the Vietnam War, which was a truly bitter experience, not only for the American military, but for the American people. It was a disaster. But the one thing most of us learned in those years is that we were not fighting communism in Vietnam. We were fighting Vietnamese nationalism. The United States inflicted tremendous punishment on the Vietnamese people. You know how powerful the American military is. You know how the American military privileges firepower over manpower. Right? We killed huge numbers of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, and they just kept coming back because they wanted us out just like they wanted the French out before us, and just like they wanted the Japanese out during World War II. They wanted sovereignty, right? As I said to you before, think about the United States. Think about Germany. You don't like the Russians interfering in your election. You don't like the Russians doing social engineering in your country. Well, don't be surprised if the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Russians, and the Chinese, by the way, don't like you doing social engineering in their countries. Sovereignty. Nation states privilege. Sovereignty. It's very important to understand that. So when we invaded Iraq in 2003 and thought this was all going to go swimmingly, we were deluding ourselves. So it was going to work out that way. Same thing in Afghanistan. By the way, you all know the Soviets went into Afghanistan. That one worked out real well, didn't it? 1980 to 1988. I remember when the Soviets went into Afghanistan. It was actually 1979. Everybody in the national security community in the United States was beside themselves. Oh my God, the Soviets are on the march. This is the end of the world. I said, you're crazy. This is wonderful news. They just jumped into a briar patch. They invaded Afghanistan. It's like Vietnam. If you ever get in great power competition, what you want is for your adversary to invade Vietnam or Afghanistan. I tell people, when I used to go to China in the early 2000s, I tell the Chinese, you know what you ought to do? You ought to tell the Americans that you're counting on them to win the war on terror, and that they have to stay in Iraq and Afghanistan until they win. They'll be there forever, grinding their military to bits, spending God knows how much money, and the Chinese can just sit on the sidelines, right? In the age of nationalism, you've got to be very careful. You start thinking about conquering countries, occupying them, and doing social engineering. And you understand, this is what liberal hegemony was all about. It was all about massive social engineering. It was shoving a particular political system down other people's throats. Also, liberals tend to oversell individual rights. Most people around the world do care about individual rights, but they don't care that much. They care mainly about security. You go to a place like Iraq or Libya, which is the Wild West, they're not worrying about individual rights that much. They just want to live in a safe neighborhood. Go to Russia today. Russia identifies liberalism, liberal democracy, and individual rights with the 1990s. Been there, done that, don't want to go back. We'll take the soft authoritarianism that comes with Putin. You might not like that. That's fine. But they have a very different view. And again, liberalism is predicated on the assumption that states can have different views about what is the best political system. The fact is that there have been times in history where states thought fascism was a fantastic political system, where they thought communism was a fantastic political system. It's not been the case that everybody thought liberal democracy was wonderful all the time. People have disagreements. So we oversold individual rights. And then there's the power of realism. I'll say a few words about this. The idea that you can take NATO and march it up to Russia's border and not have a reaction is remarkably foolish. And of course, this is what people in the West to include the Germans, and especially the Americans, believed. You talk to Michael McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. He will tell you that he told Putin and Putin's lieutenants that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia. He told Putin that the Americans are filled with benign intentions, and they were not moving NATO eastward to contain Russia. He believed that, and I believe it was true. They did not think they were threatening Russia. Russia was not a threat in 2005, 2010, certainly not a threat in the 1990s. Look at the deployment of Russian military forces in their western military districts. In 2014, when the Ukraine crisis breaks out, there's hardly any military forces there. Right? It's just, they just weren't a big problem. We were trying to create a zone of peace. We're trying to spread liberal hegemony. But if you're Russia, you see NATO, which was a mortal foe during the Cold War, marching up to your border. You see the West trying to turn Ukraine and Georgia into Western bulwarks on your border. Great powers do not tolerate that. And my favorite example is the United States of America. I don't know how many of you know this, but we in the United States of America have something that's called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically says, to put it in crude terms, we own the Western Hemisphere, and no distant great power, be it from Asia or from Europe, is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere or form an alliance, a military alliance with any country in the Western Hemisphere. You're not allowed to do that. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Some of the people in the audience are old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cubans had the audacity to allow the Soviets to put nuclear weapons on Cuban territory in the Western Hemisphere. The United States went ballistic. And then the Cubans were thinking about allowing the Soviets to build a naval base at Cienfuegos. This is one of the principal reasons we still hate the Cubans, right? We've never gotten over this. Who are these people to invite the Soviets into the Western Hemisphere? Fast forward 30 years, China's continued to grow. Canada forms a military alliance with China. Mexico forms a military alliance with China. They put a couple armored division equivalents in Toronto and Mexico City. What do you think the United States is going to do? China's going to say, we're a benign hegemon, or we're a benign great power. We're not threatening you. You think the United States is going to see it that way? I can guarantee you we're not going to see it that way. We're going to go ballistic, right? That's not going to happen. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. We can have a Monroe Doctrine. Don't you think they should have one? They have one. Go to China today. Go to Beijing. Go behind closed doors with some of the leaders in China and ask them what they think of those American aircraft and American naval ships going up and down their coastline. They will tell you in no uncertain terms they hate it. And what they will plan to do when they get more and more powerful is drive us out beyond the first island chain and then drive us out beyond the second island chain. I don't blame them one bit. I like the Monroe Doctrine as an American. If I were Chinese, I certainly wouldn't want the Americans in my backyard. I'd do everything I could to get them out of the region. So you think the Russians are going to be happy about NATO expansion plus EU expansion? And then just to go back up to nationalism, the color revolutions, we were hinting that there was going to be a big color revolution in Moscow. You think Putin was happy about that? I can guarantee he was not. One final point here, just on illiberal liberalism. Just to go back to where I started. Remember what I said about liberalism? Liberalism is predicated on the assumption that people can't agree about first principles. They can't agree about the big questions in life. Actually, if you think about it, liberal hegemony assumes that there is an approved solution as to what is the perfect political system. Liberal hegemony is a remarkably intolerant foreign policy. We're saying we have the approved solution and we're going to shove it down your throat. So in a very important way, it's kind of an illiberal form of liberalism. But regardless, it failed miserably. Brings me to my final comment. What's liberal hegemony's future? It has two big problems. First is Donald Trump. It is very important to understand that Donald Trump ran directly against liberal hegemony. He said, we are getting out of the business of spreading liberal democracy around the planet. He's very clear on this. He's given all sorts of talks about the importance of sovereignty and nationalism and not interfering in the politics of other countries. He's not into social engineering, and as you all know, he likes to cavort with dictators and authoritarian leaders. So the most important element of liberal hegemony, kaput. Second, spreading an open international economy. This guy likes tariffs. He's not a big fan of an open international economy. Liberals who promote an open international economy tend to see it as an expanding pie, not a zero-sum game. He sees economic competition as a zero-sum game. He thinks you Germans are screwing we Americans. He thinks the Japanese and the South Koreans are screwing the Americans. The Chinese are screwing the Americans. And he wants to put tariffs on. Okay? And then finally, with regard to institutions, this guy's never seen an institution that he didn't loathe. NATO is obsolete. The EU has decided he's public enemy number one. He hates NAFTA. He hates the WTO. He hates the World Bank. He hates the IMF. The first thing he did when he came to office was get out of the TPP or kill the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's really quite amazing how contemptuous he is of institutions. He ran against liberal hegemony, and he won. This is the real key, though. Remember what I said early on. You can't have liberal hegemony without unipolarity, because you need to take balance of power politics off the table. Well, unipolarity is in the rear view mirror, right? We are moving into a world where there are two great powers out there that we have to deal with. One, and most importantly, is China, which is going to be a real problem for us if it continues to grow. And then the other is Russia. Putin has brought the Russians back from the dead, and they now have quite significant military power, and they are a problem for us as well as the Chinese. So we are now deeply concerned about balance of power politics as it applies to China and as it applies to Russia. And in that world, it's impossible to pursue liberal hegemony. So the 1-2 punch here, and this is what I'll quit on, the 1-2 punch that has sort of knocked liberal hegemony off the table is, one, the election of Donald Trump. And by the way, Trump got elected because the American public understands full well that our foreign policy has been a failure, right? But one is Donald Trump, and then two is the coming of multipolarity. Thank you.